I now give the floor to Mr. Peter Maurer.
President, Secretary General, esteemed colleagues. Secretary General Guterres' report card on the state of protection highlights the enormous violations and the failures to protect men, women, and children around the globe. Communities caught in the crossfire of armed conflict suffer shock after shock, violation after violation, until their resilience is threadbare. I am concerned for people, for the rising numbers of people displaced, stuck in limbo without any prospect of lasting solutions to their plight, for the millions of families searching endlessly for their missing loved ones, for the urban poor, elderly, people detained, migrants, refugees, women, survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, people with disability. I'm concerned for broken places and systems, the migration and displacement camps, and the prisons where human dignity is as absent as clean water and sanitation. I'm concerned for emerging threats, the rapid spread of hate speech, stigmatization of all kinds, data misused to suppress or control populations instead of protecting them. I'm concerned for the shrinking space for neutral, impartial, and independent humanitarian work. And I'm concerned for the behaviors of belligerents and all who support them, for the violations of human life and dignity caused by persistent disregard or expedient interpretation of international humanitarian law and other international legal frameworks. In particular, I raise the devastating impacts for civilians when explosive weapons with a wide impact area are used in populated areas. The death and destruction left behind by heavy explosive weapons raises serious questions about international humanitarian law compliance and signals the urgent need for a change of behavior to protect civilians, including by avoiding the use of such weapons in populated areas. A strong, unequivocal political declaration committing states to take concrete action in this direction would be a good first step. The ICRC is working on policy and operational level recommendations to this end. Dear colleagues, the divisions in the Council on critical concept of humanitarian law and work, notably access to population in need, are increasing the suffering on the front lines. While the ICRC takes responsibility to deliver neutral and impartial humanitarian services independently and within the legal framework of the Geneva Conventions, it is your responsibility to facilitate access to populations in need. You are obliged to proactively facilitate access and not to pile mountains of bureaucratic and political obstacles on humanitarian organizations. You are not asked to tell humanitarian organizations who is in need, but rather to allow neutral and impartial organizations to do independent needs assessments in full transparency. And if there are divisions on whether people in a specific context are in need or not, I would expect states to allow humanitarians to do their jobs as a default precautionary measure unless imperative security reasons prohibit. International humanitarian law principles and concepts have been developed to protect people, not to make a point towards your political adversaries. I urge you to base your policies in this regard on the law, which is the only reasonable basis for consensus, and to leave political controversies outside of humanitarian concerns. Dear colleagues, the COVID-19 crisis is fast threatening to become a protection crisis. At a time when they are most needed, helpers are under attack. Health systems are targeted. Health workers are abused. Since March this year, the ICRC has recorded 208 COVID-19 related attacks against healthcare in 13 countries in which we operate. The socio-economic impacts will cause new waves of despair, leaving people facing hunger and poverty exposed to abuse and exploitation. States' response to the pandemic shows the risk that without checks and balances, emergency health measures can become abusive tools to control a population's movement or withhold services. We fear that some groups, perhaps those considered the enemy, may be excluded from life-saving measures. For example, any vaccine distribution in volatile and contested places will be difficult, but it must be available to all equitably. On a more positive note, states have also stepped up in response to the pandemic, implementing more humane policies. If I have optimism during this bleak crisis, it is because I see the potential for actors to take measures during this crisis which spark a recommitment in support of humanitarian protection. For example, we have seen the safe releases from detention of many people deprived of liberty, the decisions to regularize non-documented migrants to ensure they can access healthcare, and the adoption of unilateral ceasefires. Arms bearers remain engaged with ICRC during the crisis with new opportunities for dialogue and advice arising. As police forces and military personnel are called on to maintain public order, the ICRC has maintained a dialogue with public forces to ensure that international law is upheld when conducting operations. And as part of our broader dialogue with hundreds of non-state armed groups across the world, the ICRC is engaged with Islamist and Salafi scholars in the Sahel on a fatwa on COVID-19, giving guidance on the respect of the deceased and on health protocols. I'm also encouraged by the potential for multi-stakeholder responses to influence behaviors. This week, 40 global leaders joined the ICRC's call on governments to work together to stop cyber attacks on the healthcare sector. Excellencies, it cannot be overstated. The extreme vulnerability of people in conflict zones to repeated shocks is in large part the result of a disregard of states and other belligerents' legal obligations towards population under their control over many years. Respecting and ensuring respect for IHL in all circumstances would protect people from the impact of war, but also shield against the subsequent shock waves, whether health, economic, or environmental. We call on you to ensure that in all situations, whether enforcing exceptional measures in response to the public health emergencies, during the conduct of hostilities, or in situations of public unrest, that your response are guided by the utmost respect for the protection of civilians. We also call you to respect the dignity and rights of persons deprived of liberty, the deceased and the families of the missing. We ask that you are stronger in word and deed, in upholding international humanitarian law, improving behaviors on the battlefields, and ensuring that human life and dignity is protected without exception. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maurer, for your brief.